The Hook 14,000 men walked into the mountains of Macedonia, and they walked out unable to see the road beneath their feet. They moved in a long staggering column, each group of 99 men led forward by a single soldier who alone had been permitted to keep one eye. The rest had lost both. Behind them lay a battlefield already gone silent, and ahead of them, waiting in his capital, was a king who did not yet know that the empire he had spent decades building was about to die of grief. This was not a massacre carried out in a moment of battlefield chaos. It was a punishment engineered with total calculation. A message written in ruined flesh and delivered across an entire mountain range, so that no one who saw it coming home would ever forget what it meant to defy the Roman Empire of the East. The context by the final years of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire and the First Bulgarian Empire had been locked in a war that had already consumed most of a generation. The conflict had no clean beginning that either side could agree upon. Only decades of raids, broken truces, and shifting borders across the Balkans. On the Bulgarian side stood Tsar Samuil, a resourceful and stubborn ruler who had rebuilt Bulgarian power out of the wreckage of earlier defeats and had spent years harassing Byzantine territory, striking deep into Greece and even reaching the walls of Byzantine cities far from the traditional frontier. On the Byzantine side stood Emperor Basil II, a man who had come to the throne as a teenager, amid court intrigue, and had spent the first years of his reign fighting to simply survive rebellions from his own generals, before he ever turned his full attention to Bulgaria. By the time Basil was ready to commit himself entirely to the Bulgarian War, he was no longer the uncertain young ruler who had once needed regents to manage his empire. He had become something colder and more patient, a man whose reign would eventually earn him the grim epithet Bulgar-Slayer, though that name had not yet been written into history when the year 1014 began. For years he had ground down Bulgarian strongholds one by one, refusing the kind of decisive open battle that might have ended the war quickly, and instead choosing a slower campaign of attrition that suited both his temperament and his resources. Samuil, for his part, understood that time was working against him, and in the summer of 1014 he made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He resolved to block the Byzantine army in the mountain passes near the village of Kleidion, in the Balasica range, using fortified earthworks and palisades to seal off the narrow valley road that Basil's forces needed to cross. For a time, the plan worked. The Byzantine army, funneled into the narrow terrain, could not break through the Bulgarian defenses by direct assault, and the campaign stalled in a way that must have given Samuil genuine hope that he had finally found the terrain to match his enemy's patience with his own. But Basil had generals who understood the ground as well as the Bulgarians did, and one of them found a path around the fortifications, a steep and difficult route through the hills that allowed a Byzantine force to circle behind the Bulgarian position entirely undetected. When that flanking force struck from the rear, the battle collapsed within hours. Bulgarian soldiers who had believed themselves protected by impassable terrain found the Empire's soldiers descending on them from a direction they had never thought to defend. The corps would follow at Kleidion was not simply a defeat. It was an annihilation so total that it left the entire Bulgarian military structure in the region in ruins. And it left Basil with an unusual problem: an enormous number of captured soldiers, reported by chroniclers to number around 14,000 men, far too many to absorb as prisoners, far too dangerous to simply release back into Samuil's service, and far too numerous to execute without staining the campaign with a slaughter that even by the standards of the age might have been considered excessive. Basil chose something else instead, a punishment designed not to kill but to remove these men permanently from the war while ensuring that the manner of their return would do more damage to Bulgarian morale than their deaths ever could. The order was given for the fire prisoners to be blinded, group by group. In a process organized with the same discipline the empire applied to its administrative registers. The men were divided into groups reported at around 100 each, and within every group, 99 were blinded completely, while the 100th man was left with a single eye. The chroniclers who recorded this moment do not linger on the mechanics with excessive detail, but the accounts that survive describe a process carried out systematically over what must have been an agonizing stretch of time, given the sheer number of men involved. It was not the frenzied violence of a battlefield. It was closer to an industrial operation, methodical, repeated thousands of times, soldier after soldier held in place, while the same procedure was carried out on him as had just been carried out on the man before. The reasoning behind leaving 1 man in every 100 with partial sight was itself a form of cruelty layered on top of cruelty. It was not mercy. It was function. Someone needed to lead each column home, and a single guide for every 99 blind men meant that the march back to Bulgarian territory would actually succeed, that the message would actually arrive rather than dissolving into thousands of men wandering lost and starving in the mountains before they ever reached anyone who mattered. The empire wanted Samuil to see the result with his own eyes, and to do that, enough of the column needed to survive the journey intact. What resulted was one of the most haunting processions described in medieval European history. A column of blinded men moving in groups strung along mountain roads, each led by a partially sighted companion, walking for days through the same terrain where they had marched to battle only weeks before, this time as living evidence of what happened to armies that resisted Basil's empire. The physical suffering involved in that journey alone. Men with fresh, untreated wounds where their eyes had been, stumbling over uneven ground, dependent entirely on the guidance of a single half-blind leader per 100, can hardly be overstated. Many likely did not survive the march at all, though the chronicles focus their attention on the arrival rather than the journey, on the moment the column reached Samuil's court, because that was the moment the entire operation had been designed to produce. The aftermath when the surviving column finally reached Tsar Samuil. The accounts describe a reaction that has become one of the defining images of the entire Byzantine-Bulgarian War. Samuil, confronted with the physical reality of what had happened to his army, the sheer scale of the mutilation carried out on men who had served him, reportedly collapsed from the shock. Chroniclers state that he suffered what appears to have been a stroke or a similar physical collapse brought on by the horror of the sight, and that he died 2 days later, never fully recovering from what he had witnessed. Whether every detail of this account has survived transmission with perfect accuracy is a question historians continue to weigh, given that our primary sources were writing with the benefit of hindsight and an interest in cementing Basil's fearsome reputation. But the core of the event, the blinding, the march, and Samuil's death shortly after receiving his soldiers, is treated as historical fact by the overwhelming majority of scholarship on the period. Samuil's death did not end the war immediately, but it broke something essential in Bulgarian resistance that never fully recovered. The empire he had spent years rebuilding began to fracture through internal succession disputes among his heirs, weakening Bulgarian unity at the exact moment it most needed strength to continue resisting Byzantine pressure. Basil continued his campaign in the years that followed, and by 1018, Bulgaria's independence as a unified state came to an end. Absorbed into Byzantine imperial administration for the first time in centuries, the empire that Basil left behind at his death in 1025 stretched further than it had in generations, and the brutal efficiency of Kleidion's aftermath became inseparable from how both his contemporaries and later historians remembered him. The epithet history attached to Basil, Bulgar-Slayer, was not born from the battle itself, which had been a matter of tactical maneuvering more than raw savagery. It was born from what came after, from the calculated decision to turn thousands of defeated, men into a walking warning rather than simply prisoners of war or casualties of battle. It is a reminder that some of history's most enduring reputations for cruelty were built not on the chaos of combat, but on decisions made afterward, in cold blood, with full deliberation, by men who understood exactly what kind of message they wanted their enemies to carry home. The conclusion: what lingers about the blinding of Samuil's army is not simply the scale of the physical suffering inflicted, though that alone is difficult to comprehend at a distance of 1,000 years. It is the calculation behind it, the recognition by an empire's ruler that breaking an enemy's body was less effective than breaking an enemy's spirit, and that the most efficient way to do the second was to force that spirit to witness the first with its own eyes, one final time before those eyes were taken forever. Basil II built an empire on the foundation of many campaigns, many sieges, and many years of grinding, patient warfare. But it is this single episode, a column of blinded men walking home through the mountains, that history has chosen to remember most vividly. A stark demonstration of how far human beings have been willing to go to ensure that a defeat is never merely felt, but permanently, visibly, unforgettably carried.